The purpose of the School of Kindness project is to try to show people how our world really works. I started it because the way our world really works is very, very different from the way most people think it works. And I believe that explaining this difference in understanding and showing why that difference exists is a kindness. Perhaps not to some of those whose fantasies might be shattered by learning some painful truths, but it's certainly an act of kindness to future generations. And I do it in the hope that by trying to enlighten my generation, future generations will not be as abused by their governments as my contemporaries are certainly abused by ours. This talk concentrates on the subject of our physical security. Economic security is also a very important subject, but as I'll be doing a separate talk on economics in the fairly near future, I'll deal with the issue of economic security then. Few people would disagree with the notion that the first duty of government is to provide for the physical security of its people. Firstly, by ensuring we're fairly safe from attack by foreign armies, and then by ensuring we're protected from criminals within our own society. All other functions of government are utterly meaningless unless we're first kept reasonably safe from the willful violence and mischief of others. But there's a condition, a very important condition. The safety thus provided must not be at the cost of our personal freedom. It could be argued, for example, that the state could keep us perfectly safe from domestic harm simply by locking everyone up in solitary confinement. But security purchased at such a price is obviously too expensive. So the first duty of the state must surely be to ensure we are safe and free. This should not be a very difficult thing to achieve, as the vast majority of us would love to live in such a world, if only we could. Yet the painful truth is that as far as the powerful military nations are concerned, a peaceful and secure world full of free people is the very last thing that they really want. Some would think that view is too cynical and might rightly ask for proof. Well, perhaps the most compelling proof is simply to open one's eyes and observe the state of the planet, to really see the obvious and abundant evidence of permanent war, resulting in terrible suffering and oppression for millions of people every day of the week, and then to ask, well, where is the counter-evidence? Where is the proof that our great trusted leaders have laboured tirelessly throughout the decades and centuries to ensure world peace? When did they ever do that? Given the abundant evidence of wars they're starting and managing all around the world, even with their ruthless stranglehold on good information, where's the proof they're really trying to provide world peace right now? Given that the vast majority of ordinary people would never dream of intentionally harming anyone or intentionally behaving in a criminal way, it would be reasonable to assume that providing security should not be a particularly difficult thing for a government to do. After all, preaching to the converted has never been very difficult. It should, given the almost universal desire by most people for a free and peaceful life, be reasonable to assume that governments could treat the prospect of foreign invasions as extremely unlikely, and the risk of violence and criminal attack from within our own society as pretty negligible. But this is not what happens. Britain has not been at serious risk of foreign invasion since 1940. The biggest existential threat our nation faces is from our so-called special relationship in the West, not from the East. And that threat is so immense we have no conventional remedy against it anyway. At home, a quick glance at the statistics shows that there has been no significant rise in terrorist outrages, and recorded crime has not risen significantly for at least 30 years, and quite probably considerably longer. Yet our government is doing everything in its power to convince us that our safety and security is in dire peril. There's hardly a street corner anywhere in the country which is not monitored by half a dozen so-called security cameras. You cannot walk into any public building without passing through security barriers, locked doors, or being suspiciously examined by security guards dressed as though they're expecting an imminent alien invasion. Every electronic communication we send and receive is routinely spied upon by secret government agencies, some of whom are not even our government agencies, and supposedly in our best interests. Yet just one generation ago, almost none of these things existed, or were deemed necessary. Policemen strolled around the streets in relatively comfortable clothing, and took pride in the fact that they were unarmed. Security guards in most public buildings were unheard of, public servants could and did wear almost any clothing they liked, and although the government could still spy on us, and often did, it was not routine practice, and each bugging had, in theory at least, to be sanctioned by a court order. Given that those were the days when the IRA were particularly active, it's clear to see that there has been no significant change to possible threats in our security in all that time, and probably longer. So why must we now endure a Big Brother surveillance state, robocops, and secret courts? In spite of the fact that there has been no significant change to the possibilities of foreign attack for more than half a century, we have recently seen the sacrifice by our trusted leaders of a core principle that has existed more or less unmolested for almost 1,000 years. The almost sacred principle of habeas corpus, which has mostly prevented the authorities from imprisoning anyone for more than a day, unless that person could be charged with a crime. This provision survived more or less intact in England through numerous wars and the recent 30-year conflict with the IRA, and this long-standing principle, preventing the police locking up people for any length of time without evidence of a crime, has never seriously compromised the security of the British people. Yet on the 11th of June 2008, the British House of Commons passed a bill allowing the authorities to imprison anyone they like for up to 6 weeks, without being charged with a crime. They did this without any evidence whatsoever that the move was necessary to provide for our security. Ignoring completely this lack of evidence, the officials who pressed for this change had originally called for the right to imprison people without any charge for up to 3 months. Outrageous though this situation most certainly is, it's far from the full extent of the problem we face. Non-citizens can be imprisoned indefinitely without charge, their lawyers prevented from seeing the evidence against them, and they can eventually be tried and convicted in secret. We also know that our trusted authorities have regularly colluded with American authorities in their special relationship and aided the US government in their obscene extraordinary rendition program, whereby people are transported for imprisonment to barbaric client states known to use torture. And today our so-called defense force colludes with the empire to commit murder every week with their despicable drones. All these actions are indistinguishable from the most vicious and repressive tyrannies. Although these dreadful events have attracted a little media attention, the real seriousness of it has never widely commented on. Even Winston Churchill, not especially famous for his humane and compassionate nature, might have been appalled by the situation we now accept as normal. For he once said, "The power of the executive to cast a man into prison without formulating any charge known to the law, and particularly to deny him the judgment of his peers, is in the highest degree odious, and the foundation of all totalitarian government." Mr. Churchill wrote those words in November 1943 in a telegram to the Home Secretary. Bear in mind that at the time, Britain was deeply engaged in the Second World War, which was a very real war, not the flimsy smoke and mirrors variety created today by devious people with despicable motives. Consider how much the times have changed when this ancient and precious right, that was clearly highly prized by Churchill, can now be casually discarded without any justification at all, and not a murmur of dissent do we hear from the mainstream media. All this repression and criminality and more when we have no risk whatever of an enemy invasion, and there's been no significant rise in domestic crime figures for at least 30 years. Because if none of these security measures were needed a generation ago, when at least there was a theoretical risk of invasion from the east and an actual terrorist threat from Ireland, it's fairly safe to conclude that the real reason for all this extra security is for our government to impose tighter controls, greater restrictions, less freedom against its very own people. Why might it want to do that? As is often the case, history can suggest a clue. Probably the longest previous periods of suspension of habeas corpus occurred shortly after the French Revolution. As the plutocrats of Europe banded together to crush the continent's first fledgling modern democracy, Britain scrapped habeas corpus and introduced vicious legislation, such as the combination laws. Both actions intended to ensure that no ordinary Britons nurtured any scurrilous ideas from France about possibly ruling themselves. That these laws were deliberately targeted against honest workers struggling to improve their conditions cannot be doubted. Economic historian H.O. Meredith, for example, observed this. The legislation of 1799 and 1800, combined with the law of conspiracy, made it criminal to join a trade union or organise a strike. Technically, combination of the employers was as illegal as combination of the men. In practice, it seems to have been easy to convict the men, impossible to convict the masters. Imposing laws that scrap our freedom are not intended to protect us, as is always claimed. They're intended to serve and protect the 1%. I hope to show that those we trust to lead us have no interest at all in the same values of decency that we normally extend to others, values we expect and usually receive from others in return. Our trusted leaders and their handlers operate with entirely different values to ours. Consider, for example, the revealing words of Sir Garnet Wolseley, who was once Chief of the British Army. We are bred up to feel it a disgrace ever to succeed by falsehood. We will keep hammering along with the conviction that honesty is the best policy and that truth always wins in the long run. These pretty little sentiments do well for a child's copybook, but a man who acts on them had better sheath his sword forever. So, here we have honesty and truth, which are highly valued by most of us, being casually dismissed by this great and powerful soldier as pretty little sentiments, suitable only for a child's copybook.